Thank you so much. It's an honor to be with you all. And it's a blessing to listen to such powerful music. Thank you. The chalice lighting this morning, let it fill us. Let it hold our hearts. We light this chalice for breath. Breath is necessary for life, yet during pandemic carries virus that kills. Breath of life is free to all, yet through systemic oppression, the very breath of life is choked, strangled from people whose skin is black. The breath we share with all that exists is superheated now by addiction to fossil fuels that make some people comfortable, some people rich and powerful, and far too many people and creatures and ecosystems collateral damage. We light this chalice for breath, for complex truth, for living in new ways that will bring healing breath to life. Please join one another and rise in spirit, if you will, to sing our next hymn. Breath. Good morning. Good morning. I feel so much gratitude for all the artists, for the musicians, for the poets, for the storytellers, the story writers. We need the arts, not only to survive, but to thrive. And I am so grateful. So, good morning. As you settle into late morning in Massachusetts, I have settled into a hotel in Northern California, where it is raining very hard. And my computer connection, my Wi-Fi connection has proven to be skittish. So here's what I invite you to do if I just disappear. I ask that you stay connected to the service through the thread that runs through everything in this service. And some of the words of our beautiful poet laureate: we will not be lenient with our future. We refuse to lose. Keep rising for an earth more than worth fighting for. With these things in mind, I'm going to invite you now, as I speak, if I go away, and I'll come back, and maybe in your small groups, maybe in your work in committees, long after today, think about what it is that you, your family, your neighborhood, your congregation, and your region have needed in order to not just survive the pandemic, but in many cases to thrive. What have you needed? I've made a list of 14 or 15, and I'm sure you can do a whole lot more. Think about that as I wend my way through this service, as I disappear and come back again, and as you begin and continue to think together as a congregation, how COVID connects to climate change and to systemic oppression. And so that is what I'll be speaking about this morning. So be prepared. If I disappear, you know what to do. We refuse to lose. So this morning, I invite us to consider how COVID-19 and systemic oppression and climate change are linked, and not only through destruction, but also through strategies for getting through, for healing, and for hope. We can listen to communities of people most exposed to climate devastation, who create new ways of being. We can think together and imagine ways to navigate pandemic, oppression, and climate crisis to increase resilience of all people and beings, living in more just relationships with others, and sharing the possibilities to generate well-being. We have learned more about these things through the pandemic. So I think one of the best ways to start is to realize that the past year, 2020, and now into 2021, are extraordinary times, threshold years of disruption of everything. In threshold times, we don't expect to go back into what was. We are crossing a threshold. We are knowing on a threshold that we must move into something unknown. We're leaving something behind and going to something unknown. That's liminal space. That is the unknown. That threshold is where we stand now. By definition, liminal space is not comfortable. Leaving the familiar behind and witnessing the collapse of familiar systems is unnerving at best, terrifying, and life-threatening to way too many. So even if you're looking forward, as I am, to leaving something that feels wrong behind us in order to create something life-sustaining, the lack of a clear path in itself tends to create insecurity for we humans. We tend to resist the unfamiliar. So to be present to liminal space, where we are more likely to intentionally co-create what we believe to be life-affirming for all, requires a great deal of us. Central, paramount, is to become more present. One way to do that is simply by breathing. In recognition of liminal space and time, would you take a moment now to focus on your breath? Let the in-breath bring gratitude for breath itself. And with your out-breath, recognize you are in liminal time and space, an uncertain space. Check in with how you are. Breathe. How goes it with your body, your soul? Breathe. And let the next in-breath bring gratitude, even in the midst of change and strife. Gratitude. Let the next out-breath offer compassion for you, for yourself. We are so flawed, and we are together capable of extraordinary beauty and strength, both and. Breathe in these truths. Breathe. Prepare moment by moment to step into the unknown. That's what is asked of us. No matter how comfortable we or our neighbors may seem, we do live in liminal times, extraordinary times, at the intersection of COVID-19 crisis, collapsing governmental and economic systems, and the rocking of systems that have for hundreds of years controlled Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. And we know that the climate is changing dangerously. And we breathe in the truth of these things. Whether we are comfortable, overwhelmed, or focused like warriors, breath will bring us to necessary center, open us to necessary truth, and prepare us for necessary purpose. So in recognition of this liminal time of catastrophic disaster, we breathe in a moment more. Then breathe in the possibility and the necessity of what author Nafeez Ahmed calls catastrophic success. catastrophic success. So stories can help us take this in. 40 Unitarian Universalist climate and congregational leaders gathered in Detroit. This is a precursor to the book Earth Justice. The book Earth Justice, which you may know, came out of this time together in Detroit. We came to learn together and to strategize ways forward for our UU faith community in a time of economic collapse and intensifying climate devastation. We didn't even know about the coming pandemic. We in Detroit witnessed abandoned factories, stores and houses, and we walked through gutted neighborhoods. Then we visited a few of the hundreds of experiments for life-giving success happening throughout the city. We met Grace Lee Boggs, a local and international icon for strategic life-giving change, a leader. She and her husband created the Boggs Center, a community-based learning and training hub that prepares local people of all ages to think critically and systemically about oppression and human evolution into life-giving systems. We visited a few of more than 1,400 neighborhood gardens where families helped grow and harvest food for themselves, where youth would stop in and watch a tomato ripen day to day, and then they'd get to eat it. Within the city of Detroit, home to nearly 1,400 and more community gardens and farms now, there's one officially designated first sustainable urban agrihood, the Michigan Urban Farming Initiative. It's a nonprofit in the North End neighborhood where the median home value is under $25,000, and about 35% of the people are homeowners. It's a sustainable farm created in collaboration with, harvested, and used by the poorest people, where they can walk to get that food. We Unitarian Universalist thinkers and creators and climate activists ate at a restaurant that used local foods, supporting local farmers, run by at-risk youth and young adults, now trained for the field of hospitality, now supporting their families and neighborhoods. We visited and chatted with minister and youth in a large old mainline congregation whose few remaining white members stepped into the unknown and gave their building to a young Black minister who, with many dozens of volunteers, recruited the gun-wielding youth into worship that they could relate to. These churchgoers turned their basement into cubicles of cottage industry. One section teaches wood skills. Another gathers found discarded bicycle parts and teaches kids how to make their own bicycles for free. Other kids make radios out of coffee containers, learning electrical skills. Others learn to sew or to cook or do their homework where there is light and heat not available in their homes. All of this is volunteer run, with the exception of the church staff. All incredibly life-changing for everyone involved, and then in the households of each involved person, catastrophically successful for those involved. In this liminal time, this time of collapse, we can learn from Detroit neighbors and from leaders on the front lines of crisis all over the world, more of what we know to rapidly co-create positive, life-affirming alternatives at every level. The transition has been happening for a while and became more focused, much more visible during the pandemic. We can choose to support those ideas and those leaders, and we can participate where we're welcomed. We can step off the threshold of not knowing into even more unfamiliar evolution and revolution on local and international stages, led by frontline communities and people of power who are willing and able to be informed, to listen, and to collaborate. Author Nafis Ahmed has a phrase of catastrophic success that I've shared with you. And it reminds me to step out of numbing overload. And I'm guessing many of you felt this throughout COVID, and when we listen to the realities of climate change, and when we feel the devastation of racism and systemic oppression. If we can step out of that numbing overload and find the stories of just transition and resistance to oppression and oppressive systems, we'll be able to build more resilience and really reach into and develop community mutual aid. We can do this for our own well-being. We have done this for our own well-being and the well-being of others. And we can join with whatever is next. Instead of standing on the threshold and stepping back into what we have known, we can, with more courage, step off the threshold into what we actually don't know, because there's no path. And we can choose to focus our attention and our energies and give our gifts in ways that will recreate and regenerate life that is sustainable. So COVID gathered our collective attention and response within the span of 1 year, where decades of what civil rights activist and Congressman John Lewis called good trouble, and decades of warnings from climate scientists have yielded inadequate response and more often resistance. COVID is a difficult teacher, but it has shed light on the connection between current and future pandemics, social uprisings against stark systemic inequities, and on what must be done to stop and also attempt to adapt to climate change. When this sermon began to take shape a year ago, I was watching yet another news broadcast of COVID-19. I was brought to my feet out of numbness as I experienced the now iconic phrase, flatten the curve, in a new way. I got it, that flattening the curve actually could unite all three of these crises: COVID, systemic oppression, and climate. So with actual shock and excitement, I made these connections. So imagine the capacity to flatten the curve. And I'm gonna see if I can do a reverse chart here. So here's the chart with the different axes, right? Imagine the capacity to flatten the curve of rising oppression and flatten the curve of intensifying climate crises to become globally recognized, carrying immediate recognition and impact. Recognition that the changes will be epic without easy solutions, infusing every level of society, and will be both terrifying and full of potential for catastrophic success. So think about your initial response to the graph with that horizontal and vertical line. So we see this all the time still, and globally, many times a day, in all forms of communication. So its lines represent contagion and death and overwhelmed healthcare systems. So my responses to the graph have included numbness, overwhelm, and fear that the line mapping them now maps us. What used to be China, what then became New York City, became us, all of us. And then the emotional responses in and around me shifted to determination, to action, commitment, and hope of better things to come. So what was the evolution of your response to seeing that graph? Now imagine something similarly graphed to include climate change and systemic oppression. You know they're going up. You feel the dread. You know it's clear that climate-related drought, famine, and respiratory failure already cause destruction and death at numbers exceeding those of the current pandemic. Why haven't we seen that spike in the graph? Why haven't we been filled as a nation and as a global community to stop the climb of this graph and to flatten the curve? There's a direct correlation between the climate impacts and where most people of color are located. There is a direct correlation between the capacity to respond with energy and focus and one's real experience of the disaster that's happening. So I believe that far too many of us have been far too comfortable to understand that climate is a catastrophe. It's not in the future. It's happening now. That racial oppression is a catastrophe, not in the future, of course, but current for all of us. So now we can breathe in the possibility of changing the graph of climate change and oppression in the same way that we're working very hard to change the graph of COVID-19. So the graphs for climate change and oppression map out the fallout of oppression and the current and projected impacts that affect all of us, not just them over far away or in a different community. My excitement about the graph connecting all three crises is this. We've seen and known the spiking crisis of climate and oppression. Those two have impacted me with numbness, overwhelm, fear, anxiety, and then urgent determination, action, and hope. The tide is changing, and we can become part of a response to climate and oppression as immediately and as creatively as we have been doing with the COVID pandemic. Think about how radically COVID changed our congregational lives. We had to build mutual support and connection in different ways. We have to think about climate and oppression with as much creativity, and step into creative collaboration and generative space and time. And so knowing that part of what has to happen is for us to feel the reality of the graph, to know that climate and oppression and COVID are all with us now. They're not future, they're not somebody else. We need to understand that too few people who hold the resources and the power, not enough of the masses, have been made uncomfortable. Too few of the people who hold the resources and the power have been uncomfortable enough for us to be motivated into action and change. So we understand as you use the dynamics common to COVID, climate, and oppression, that we as people of faith can bring our values and considerable determination to bear in ways that encourage healing of all people and planet in all three circumstances. It's time that we as a congregation and as a denomination and in our communities, we think together, imagine, and strategize what it will take to heal in all three arenas: climate, COVID, and oppressive systems. Every one of the elements necessary to respond with integrity and care to the pandemic, which you know well, are necessary to respond with integrity to uprisings against oppression and the rising devastation of climate change? Why not recognize and galvanize change that will work for all three? So this is where I'm hoping that you've been thinking about, what are those things that I needed to get through COVID? What helped me shift from devastation to creativity? What allowed mutual care and reaching out into the larger community? We know we can do this. We need to be intentional. So some of the things that I know about how we have responded to climate in order to flatten the curve can also flatten the curve of climate devastation and also oppressive systems. Mutuality is one of them. Reaching beyond our families, reaching beyond what's familiar, and extending care into the larger community, especially thinking about the most vulnerable and sharing. We know during COVID that the leadership from the highest level to leadership in every community organization, business, public service, household, and also in every aspect of the life of the congregation was necessary. The arts, education, pastoral care, all of it, leadership in every aspect of these arenas was necessary, continues to be necessary, to protect and to care for and to eventually survive and thrive beyond COVID and beyond climate and beyond oppression. This is a vision worth having. This is an understanding, I think, that's worthy of our attention as Unitarian Universalists. Another is that we know, especially if you were sitting in front of those mind-numbing endless reports of the increase of the COVID pandemic, that statistics, facts about death and destruction alone is not motivating most of us to action. Piling on more facts and graphs about more crisis doesn't mobilize us. Rather, in the face of overwhelming information, most of us stop dead in our tracks. We move back into safety, or we deny, we shut down, we stop listening to the facts because we're overloaded, it's too much. What we Unitarian Universalists know is that it's vision and possibility that's much more likely to bring people into action. In addition to the facts, we've got to have facts. We've got to have leadership. We've got to have vision and possibility that will bring people into action, because piling on facts alone sinks and overwhelms. So revision, not revision, vision requires that we understand that this is liminal time. Much must change from yesterday to today and tomorrow in all that we do as a family, as a household, as a congregation, as communities, as a nation, and a globe. We've got to change. It's liminal time. We're on that threshold. We can't delay. Motivating that positive action requires understanding that it's liminal time and that it requires sacrifice. We have all sacrificed so much during COVID, so much. And we know from experience the important role of music and art and congregations, emotional connection, real clear information. In order to connect and to help us persevere, we needed all of these things. Responding to crisis together is critical. Beyond being isolated individuals, as I know, and I've seen as a Green Sanctuary manager, that congregations, Unitarian Universalists, tend to feel more empowered to move forward as individuals. And it's not going to do it. Not for climate, not for systemic oppression, and not for pandemic. We've got to move beyond being isolated individuals and uplift creative examples and stories which create more beautiful and actions together. And we know the work of saving people and communities and businesses has to be inclusive. It's necessary to pull in all the voices, get everyone at the table, and center the voices from the front lines, not only of the medical crisis, but of neighborhoods that are already suffering from climate and neighborhoods that are, for hundreds of years now, suffering from the brutality of systemic oppression. We need to be listening to the creative leadership that's coming out of all those communities, because that's where creative resilience has been happening for hundreds of years. There's a great deal of wisdom and practice in these communities that we need to learn from and partner with. To stop a pandemic, to stop climate change, and to stop systems of oppression, we know that truthful communication must be a constant, honest and compassionate, and offering directions and invitations and opportunities to participate. Responding to climate change, responding to the oppression of communities of color must not be siloed. We've got to be creating opportunities for everyone to participate, not just the Committee on Racism, not just the Committee on Climate. We need to be talking to each other, thinking systemically together, and knowing that the things we're working on aren't connected. They're connected, and so our resolutions and our creative responses need to be connected. So, you know, as Unitarian Universalists, that at our highest levels of Unitarian Universalism, we've been working hard as a faith community to change the infrastructures and the habits of our institutions that perpetuate oppressive ways of being, unintentionally or intentionally. So learning in my own program as the manager of the Green Sanctuary program, to attend to and respond to direction from leaders on the front lines is really critical. It helps me unlearn some of the things that I've learned as a white middle class person, but it also helps me catch the creative and the immediate responses of the front lines. And so we all know it will be so good to return to some of the normal ways of connecting with friends and family and collaborators. It will be a relief for those who reach some sense of security to feel more ground under our feet. But it is critical not to look solely for familiar ground. This is liminal time and space. We've got to breathe through it. This is liminal time and space. So breathe. Our job as a faith community is to recognize our time as liminal time. Our job is to bring our core values, our collective vision, and our convictions into whatever is next as we cross over the threshold on which we currently live. Our work without a clear path is in fact our real joy, because it's to bring our love of life into new and often unknown ways, to create resilience, to build with vision and collaboration and community and care. And may that be so for us all. Blessed be. It has been an honor to witness your beautiful community. And I invite you to contemplate these words of Eric Holthaus, who wrote The Future Earth. He says, "The old world has fallen away, and there's not yet a clear vision of what the new world is going to be. The collective project of remaking the world needs to be approached with care for and active consent from everyone, because everyone is working together on a project that will be better for anything that currently exists. And he says, the next few years and decades are going to feel like falling in love, setting aside everything you thought you knew and trusting that you'll end up in a radically different place you never could have achieved on your own. May it be so for us all. Blessed be.